Welcome back to Beyond Well Science. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and today we're joined by Dr. Dee Mangin. She is the Chief Medical Officer for Risk.org. She's a family doctor originally from New Zealand, where she was director of the Primary Care Research Unit at Otago University in Christchurch. And Dee was an advisor for the New Zealand government on drug treatment funding priorities and also served on the Southern Regional Ethics Committee. Dee has since moved to Canada, and she's now the David Brayley Nancy Gordon Chair in Family Medicine at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. But most importantly, and the reason we're talking to Dee today, is that Dee is an advocate for better independent information for patients and their doctors on drugs, on drug interaction, and the rational use of drugs. Dee, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I wanted to first begin by giving people a link to the YouTube where you present and you talk about the multiple drugs that people are on in any kind of health journey, psychiatric and physical, and you liken it kind of to music. Why do you do that?
Well, I think we're in interesting times now with our. We're in a privileged position now to be living longer than ever before, but as a result it means that we all acquire multiple medications during that life and health journey. And so now the average older adult is on 7 medications. And, surely, some people think, well, surely if you need the drugs, you need the drugs. They're all good drugs and the recommendations are based on good science. So where's the problem? Well, the problem is this, is that it's a little bit like music where if you listen to a little Bach or perhaps some Miles Davis or some Leonard Cohen or Bruce Springsteen, if you play them on their own, they sound great and they do you good. They make you feel better. But if you play them all at the same time, they become a cacophony and they don't do you any good at all. And this is a bit what it's like for an older adult who's on multiple drugs. And it's sometimes called polypharmacy, which translated just means taking many drugs. But what we know is that once you get to around about 5 drugs, you have an exponentially increased chance of having a problem, either because one of your medications doesn't get along with one of your other medications, or because there's an interaction with one of your medications and one of the other conditions that you have. So, for example, in Canada here, if you're an older adult and you're on 5 or more medicines, you have over a 1 in 10 chance of having a drug side effect that requires medical attention in any 1 year. So you can see that while these are all drugs, good drugs, taken all together at the same time, you can see how good medicines can be bad for your health.
Yeah, and you were talking about just the number of people that die from falls and how many of those falls are related to medications that we know lower blood pressure too much.
That's exactly right. And again, it's interesting to refocus on what treatments are for. We're so used to with adults in midlife focusing on getting the blood pressure down low enough, so treating the high blood pressure to reduce the risk of heart attacks. But as we get older, the blood pressure that we need to be able to function for our organs to get enough blood changes. Everything, the way we metabolize drugs changes, but also our arteries get a little stiffer as well. And so you need a slightly higher blood pressure as you get older. And we can become so focused on the number and thinking, well, that's low enough. But what we sometimes can be blind to is that it's got too low, and that older adults in particular can suffer blood pressure that's too low, particularly if they stand up too quickly, and that we know can lead to falls, hospital admissions, fractures, and just general feelings of tiredness.
How do you think patients even begin to dissect whether it's the consequence of aging, whether it's the consequence of the disease process, or whether it's the consequence of taking a drug that's interacting with another drug?
Well, it's a complicated thing to sort out, but it's also a gentle art. The patients have usually lived with this combination of medications for years and years, and so it's a conversation over time to try and figure out what's going on. And it's a deprescribing is sometimes a term used to reducing or stopping medicines, and I always think that deprescribing is a team sport, and the best team for approaching it is is the team of the patient, their pharmacist who knows them and their drugs well, and their family physician who has known them over many years. And so we've actually developed a tool to try and help that team work together to figure out what's the best combination of medicines for people as they age. So the patient knows what's important to them. So they know, first of all, what their health stops them from doing that they'd like to do, and which symptoms they'd most like to have controlled by their medications, and also what they're really not interested in having controlled. So some people like to focus mostly on things that are giving them current symptoms and are not that interested in prevention of future illness, whereas other people are. So there's very much a range of what matters to people. And patients also are the experts in how drugs are actually affecting them, both in their experience of the benefits, but also in any side effects that a drug may have. So that's the really important, those are the contributions that the patient can make to that conversation. And then the pharmacist and the family doctor can then assess both the context of what the patient is telling them about what they want from their medicines and how they're experiencing them, and then look at an evidence for any medicines that may be potentially inappropriate or may be interacting with each other. And so in our TAPER pathway, TAPER actually stands for Team Approach to Polypharmacy Evaluation and Reduction. We bring all these elements together so that we make visible what matters to the patient, and then we also run through a kind of a machine screen, if you like, the patient's particular list of drugs to flag any drugs that may not work well together. And from that, the patient and the clinicians can have a really informed conversation about which drugs are most important, perhaps which drugs are least. Sometimes if you're on 18 drugs, there may be some that may be of some potential benefit, but just the sheer number means that they've got to be prioritised. So prioritising them to focus on what matters most to the patient is the most useful way to approach that.
I love that.
And I think, too, how do you go about sorting it out? Well, I always say, every drug deserves a holiday. And so taking a very gentle kind of a sort of a pause and monitor approach to each can be useful. So, if a patient thinks, I think this drug might be making me feel tired, but maybe it's old age, and the physician thinks the same, perhaps it's the drug, perhaps it's not, then you can pause that drug as long as it's a safe thing to stop. Pause it, take a holiday and pay attention to how the patient's feeling. Do they feel better off it? Often if you've been on a drug for 30 years, it's not until you have a drug holiday that you can really stand back and assess, okay, what are the benefits that I was actually getting from this drug, and how do I feel now off it? Was it having any side effects that are now noticed are gone? And so it's a sort of a conversation over time where you can take one drug at a time and just really assess in detail what the benefits are, but what the side effects are, and then the patient and the team can have a kind of a shared conversation about how do we feel about this drug going forward.
I want to, if you don't mind, Dee, go into the specifics of when a patient is treated for a psychiatric illness, because as you well know, we don't really understand why some psychiatric drugs work and others don't, or which patients it's going to work for. In many ways, it's just sort of an experiment and hope that it works out case for many. So in most psychiatric institutions, you begin to see people layered with 9, 10, 11, 12, sometimes 13 drugs. And so when you're dealing with somebody who maybe a doctor says, well, we can't really trust the state of mind that they're in, how do you actually have the patient work with you to determine which drugs you can offload?
Well, I think it just depends. I think most patients know how they're feeling and can help to assess the benefits and the side effects of drugs. And families can be really helpful as well. We take the same approach in long-term care. Perhaps when the patient is less able to speak for themselves, it's when family can become a really important part of the conversation as well. And again, it's a gentle and nuanced approach. I've always been quite interested and have done some research work on antidepressants and to try and tease out, as we know, it's only a proportion of people that benefit from the drugs, and with antidepressants certainly in the community and not so much in hospital, but that a substantial proportion of people get what's called a placebo effect as well. And so while they're getting, it's not that it's an imaginary effect, it's a real effect of taking a pill, but it's not an added benefit of the chemical. And so it's the same kind of thing, that it's a gentle approach to try and tease out, is this drug really being helpful to me, and in what ways, and is it giving me side effects?
Huh.
And when somebody's been on, a course of antidepressants, for example, it's not supposed to be a life sentence. And we did some work here in Canada, and we found that the average course length, if you like, for antidepressants is supposed to be around a year. But we found that nearly half of patients, if they were started on an antidepressant, were prescribed the antidepressant for much longer than that. And in fact, the median time for the prescription was 5 years. And so, while some people might benefit from being on them longer term, certainly not that, half of people. So it sort of tells us that in medical care we've got great systems for starting people on drugs, but we don't have good systems for reflecting and stopping on drugs when they're perhaps for longer term period of time than an antibiotic, which is just a single prescription. But as I said, it's not supposed to be a life sentence. So again, what could be helpful if you've got a complex situation with somebody who has been very unwell in the past, and nobody wants that to happen again, neither the patient or the doctor. And sometimes just stepping the dose down slightly can be a really helpful way to start to get a sense of what benefit the medication is having and what side effects it's having.
What are the drivers of polypharmacy? How did the problem develop, and why does it continue at such a high rate when patients can be at harm?
So it's partly because our system of care has developed to look at people as a collection of single diseases in isolation. So we have guidelines for treatment for diabetes, or for heart failure, or for depression. But what we know is that on average, if you have one chronic condition, then you're likely to have 3 or 5. And so we know that people don't experience these as single diseases in isolation. It's a bit like, putting petrol into a car. It mixes with the water in their radiator and the oil in the oil tank. And that's what happens with people. So if you take a 70-year-old woman and give her the 5 conditions that an average 70-year-old woman would have, and it doesn't matter which one you choose, if we take the guidelines for each of these single diseases, what happens is that woman will end up taking over 10 medicines at multiple times during the day, and that, more importantly, she will have 16 different potential opportunities for harm, either from interactions between drugs or between drugs and diseases. And that's compounded by the fact that as we age, we're much more vulnerable to the side effects of medications, and also the benefits may be less. To the extent that now we have more people admitted to hospital due to low blood sugar from the medications than from high blood pressure from the diabetes itself. And we know that, older adults taking blood pressure pills are, as we were talking about before, much more likely to have a serious injury from a fall. So it's a bit like tidying up music into its component parts of rests and minims and crotchets. This is what happens when we tidy up patients into their component diseases or drugs. We lose the meaning and context that makes it possible to hear the melodies of a person's life, but to provide treatment with medicines that will enhance it rather than overwhelm it. And I think one of the issues is that we tend to be measured as physicians for the quality of our care against adherence to these single disease guidelines. So you can see in the example that I gave you before, it would be possible for me to provide measurably good care in terms of adherence to those 5 single disease guidelines, but the care that I would provide for that woman in front of me would be meaningfully worse because of the interactions between them and the harm of all of those medications combined. And I think that in the absence of a clinical pathway or a tool or a guideline to try and deal with polypharmacy, it's kind of easier to stick with the guidelines. People are worried about being criticised for not providing good care. And I think there's also there are a number of other barriers that we know. We know that most patients would like to take less medication if they could, and they think doctors probably prescribe too much, and that drug holidays are not a bad idea, but they worry about what doctors will think if they open the conversation, and they also worry about, being able to restart a drug if they try stopping. So it's a really important part of reducing polypharmacy is everybody agrees the conditions under which you'll restart, and that restarting is not seen as any kind of failure, it's just good monitoring. But doctors also worry about starting the conversation because they worry about giving the wrong impression and somehow implying that the person is no longer worth it, when really actually by opening the conversation you're starting to provide really boutique, personalised care. But they also really, and we've talked to doctors in Canada and in New Zealand, they really worry about not following those single disease guidelines in the absence of some sort of pathway to guide them through how to deal with polypharmacy.
So do doctors also get trained in polypharmacy, Dee?
When I went to medical school, we did have training in a sense, so that we knew that polypharmacy was not a helpful thing. But I think with the rise of guidelines over the years, that has been much more the focus of care is adherence to the single disease guidelines. And I think that there has been a lack of training in how to look across all conditions at the same time, and some sort of evidence support and pathway for that. I think if you're a physician that goes on and does training in focused practice area that relates to that single disease, then the focus is on that. But I think where the advantage in training is in family medicine, where we tend to look at patients and all their diseases at the same time in a sort of coordinating role. So I think that's the real opportunity to increase the training and a sense of partnership and teamwork with patients and with pharmacists in approaching this. It's complex, but it's also, I find, one of the most enjoyable parts of my practice is working with these complexities and taking that nuanced, gentle approach to finding what's best for that particular patient.
Yeah, makes sense. So would you describe both the role of TAPER and risk.org so that if people are listening and haven't checked out either site, they can begin actually understanding what each do?
Sure. So risk.org is a site that we developed for patients and for doctors to go and get information about the potential side effects of medications. So we know that's one of the most common reasons that people go on the internet, and we wanted to provide a trusted source of information. We also wanted to provide a portal where patients could report side effects, because we know that most of the information about side effects of drugs and interactions comes after they're introduced into the general population. Most clinical trials are done in younger people who don't have multiple conditions, and so it's still an experiment when they're introduced to the general population. So what we try and do is help get people to report if they're having a side effect, and we look at that data and we try and look for signals of previously unknown or unrecorded side effects, and we've been quite successful in detecting some of those and having the labels changed on medicines to reflect that. The other thing we wanted to do was make people's stories visible about the side effects that they've been experiencing, so that we know people go on blogs, and one of the reasons they go on and look at blogs is that they go to look at other people's stories to see if they match their own. And so we wanted to make those stories visible so people can look at somebody else's experience of a drug and say, oh, that's just exactly what's happening to me. And so again, it helps them to identify if they're having side effects from drugs. It helps that conversation between doctor and patient.
Yeah, cool.
So sort of related to that has been, I've had a long-standing interest in research on rational use of drugs and being more precise about use of drugs. And because most of our work in family medicine now is looking at people with multiple conditions, and so rational use of drugs is really trying to sort out this issue of polypharmacy. And so TAPER developed out of that and out of these conversations with doctors and patients about the barriers as a pathway, a guideline, if you like, and a set of tools to try and support that conversation with the team, patient, pharmacist and family physician, to make visible and explicit what the patient's goals for care are, what their experiences of medication are, and to bring together all the tools that might flag potentially inappropriate medicines there for the pharmacist and for the physician, so they don't need to go and look anything up anywhere else. So it's all in one place to help make it easy to identify when a medication or perhaps sometimes it's not even 2 medications together. It's when you get 4 medications which have a very small side effect, but when you quadruple it, it becomes an issue. So it's to try and make that piece of it easily visible. And then within the pathway, the decision for each drug is recorded. So we offer guidance about tapering, guidance about monitoring and conditions for restarting, and guidance about which particular medicines may be more or less helpful in older adults. So it was to try and get over those barriers of starting the conversation, and to give some sense of how to start this very gentle art of deprescribing the drug holiday.
Dee, is there anything that we didn't cover, anything else that you might want to add today to the conversation?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything pretty well, and what I hope is that people listening, that it will help to start some of those conversations.
Yeah, I definitely know I'm going to have a conversation with my mom about the number of drugs. See if we can check that out and talk with her doctors a little. Dee Mangin, thank you again so much for being with us. And we want to thank the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care for their support of our program. If you want to become a sustaining member, you can click on the link now. Thanks again, Dee.
Thanks very much, Sheila.